My name is Brandon Bustede. I'm Executive Director of Education and Workforce Development at Gallup. And on behalf of Gallup, I'm delighted to have you here with us today. Not only are you on the Gallup campus today, but for at least the next hour and a half, you're also at the Northeastern University, Washington, D.C. campus. We're delighted to have partnered with Northeastern University on this very interesting study about how U.S. adults view artificial intelligence. And we're going to go into some of the findings in a little bit, but what we're going to start with is a conversation between Frank Bruni and President Aoun from Northeastern. And before I ask them to come up, I just want to say a couple things about this study. One, it's sort of difficult, as some of you may imagine, to do a study on this subject because we're talking about some fairly complex things. And when you do a nationally representative survey, it's a real challenge to have questions that people understand and can respond to. And so we did an awful lot of lead-in work to this study, a bunch of cognitive interviews where we actually sat down with people with test questions and made sure they were able to understand what we were asking and answering them in ways that we intended to understand what they were saying. And here's the irony of this. So this is a study about artificial intelligence, but it turns out we did it as a mailed survey, and I'll explain more later, but the gold standard for methodology for representative sampling today, in the year 2018, are mailed surveys with a $1 bill inside of them. By far the highest response rates of anything that happened. Northeastern University, some of you know, has really been an incredible thought leader and doer on the subject of higher education in general, and in thinking deeply about how higher education might retool and redesign itself to help people be better prepared for the workplace and in their lives as it relates to artificial intelligence and robots. President Aoun has written a book called Robot Proof that dives deeply into that. And so it was a thrill for the Gallup team to be able to work with folks from Northeastern who are real thought leaders on this subject. It's been a very innovative university, and I can speak to it personally because I was the founder and CEO of a company based in Boston for 12 years. And had 17 co-op students from Northeastern University, which I'm not even sure I told you about. And I remember Northeastern calling us. We weren't even a year old. We weren't in the phone book. And somebody from Northeastern's co-op office found us and said, "Can we come out and meet with you and talk about our co-op program?" I wasn't real interested in it at the time. I said, "Sure." And that half-hour meeting led to a 12-year relationship where we had 17 amazing co-op students from Northeastern. We ended up hiring 5 of them full-time. And the story I always share, the very first one, Kimberly Durkin, we hired when we only had 11 employees. And when she started, I made her the director of marketing because we didn't have one. So the value of that relationship is still very real in my background. And so without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Frank Bruni, phenomenal New York Times columnist, best-selling author on higher education, who has been spending a lot of his time over the last couple of years writing about higher education, and President Aoun from Northeastern University. So, gentlemen, please come up.
Hello, Frank.
Thanks. These are working great. Thanks for.
Yes.
I feel like the only place to begin is to ask you if 5 years from now, a smart machine will be sitting where I am. And maybe 10 years from now, a smart machine will be sitting where you are.
As long as they start with you first, I'm fine. I don't want to lose my job in 5 years. In 10, it's okay.
But in all seriousness, when we're talking about AI, are we talking about a future in which an event like this might not exist?
Yes, in the following way. You know, there are 2 aspects of this event. One is the fact that we are together, we are looking at each other, and and I'm looking at your body language, you're looking at mine. That, I think, will remain. The fact that people are with us here may not necessarily be the case, because people, as we speak, are looking at it from all over the world. But let's go deeper. Are you asking me, could an artificial system or robot interview me? Or can I have a conversation with you, and if I'm a robot? And the answer, yes, it could be the case. But it doesn't mean that they are going to replace us fully. And that's the point of what I'm trying to achieve in the book, is to say, if you compete with computers and artificial systems on their turf, you're going to lose. If they compete with us on our turf, they are going to lose. And therefore, the question is, what is our turf? What can humans do that robots cannot do? That's the point.
I want to come back to that, but before we do, in a moment, Brandon's going to release the findings to the survey. We're going to talk about how anxious Americans are and whether they have a lot of faith in the education they're getting. How anxious should Americans be, and how far along or behind is higher education in dealing with all of this?
You know, every time there is a radical change, you know, we have to be aware of it, and we have to understand how to manage it. And what makes me anxious is not the fact that it's happening. What makes me anxious is the fact that we are not thinking enough about it. We're not managing it. We have, and we have the Congresswoman with us. In general, and she's the exception, we have a laissez-faire attitude with respect to that. And other countries, on the other hand, are looking at it differently. That makes me anxious.
Other countries, who's doing a very kind of visionary, ahead of the game job with this? What are some countries we could learn from?
You know, there are two types of reactions to what's happening in AI. You know, I'm simplifying, but one is to say that AI is happening, the changes are happening, and therefore we have to be ready for that. And the UK, for instance, is trying to introduce a bill that will ask every company to set aside a percentage of its margin in order to re-educate people, reskill people, or upskill people. Other countries, so that's one aspect, namely how can we help people re-educate themselves, etc. Other countries are looking at it slightly differently in the following way. You know, they are looking at it as a great opportunity. For instance, in Japan, with the aging population and the fact that you don't have immigration, they are looking at it as a way of continuing with manufacturing. Robots will take care of manufacturing, and robots will take care of elderly people. So they look at it in a very positive way. And you have places like China that are looking at it and saying, whoever is going to be the leader in AI is going to win the world and dominate the world. So it's a world domination aspect, similar to what we are trying to do in various, with our industries in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in terms of robotics and AI. So people are either saying, look, we have to worry about it, and therefore let's give incentives to employers, society, etc., to re-educate people, or this is a race for domination.
You mentioned Congress, you mentioned incentives. Is the answer here governmental action, or is it higher education that has to step up in a way that it has not?
I think it has to be a continuum between higher education, employers, and also policymakers. You know, policymakers can provide incentives to employers, can provide incentives to higher education to delve into lifelong learning, because we haven't done it yet. We do it as something that is a side activity, whereas if people are going to lose jobs and if new jobs are going to be created, we have to constantly be able to re-educate ourselves and to reskill ourselves, and who's going to do it? You know, even in the survey, you will see that people are saying employers should do it. But employers also cannot do it all, because that's what they tell us. It's not our core competence. We prefer that you do it. And so if higher education does not step up and move into lifelong learning as a core mission, then we are going to leave it to employers and for-profits in general to do something like that.
When you say higher education stepping up and lifelong learning, do you mean the 4-year college model needs to go away and we need to re-envision higher education as something that's cyclical and that people keep coming back to?
Essentially, it's something that is K to gray. When you start, you're positioning yourself for a journey, a robot-proof journey. It's not going to be a point in time. You are going to have people who are finishing, for instance, high school, that need to move into a college experience. And the college experience itself is changing. It's no longer necessarily a 4-year experience. You may start in San Francisco or in Shanghai and move the second year to Boston and the third year
Sounds like
to...
you're describing Minerva Academy.
Well, yes and no, because Minerva is a step in this direction, but also you have other models that are there. But the whole idea, and I like what they are doing. What they are doing is impactful and is effective. But there are various models that are going to take the traditional notion of four-year campus in a completely different dimension, where you have to be much more mobile. There will be mobility, there will be cultural agility, the ability to be global, etc. So the models are changing, but beyond that, traditionally, when I went to school, at least, people said, now you have your degree, you're set for life. Well, on the other hand, with the new reality, you have to constantly be able to re-educate yourself, retool. So it's more a kind of subscription system for life. It's a lifelong learning approach.
Just last week, the Secretary of Education she made some comments to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and she wondered when or whether companies were just going to step into the breach and educate their employees instead of higher education. Just this week, there were news reports that Amazon had hired a star faculty member from Stanford, whose field is the science of learning. Are we possibly going to look up 5-10 years from now, if higher education doesn't respond more quickly, and see Google, Amazon, various corporations starting essentially universities of their own?
They have, for instance, IBM has a university, GE has a university, Northrop has a university, etc. But those universities that are setting up are fulfilling two functions for them. One function is a cultural function, namely we want them to understand our culture, the culture of our company, and that's why we have that. And the second function is really an educational function. And when you talk to them, to the various companies, they tell you, look, this is not our core competence. What we prefer is that you do it. But if higher education is not stepping up, so what does it mean to step up here in terms of lifelong learning? We traditionally in higher education, we build a degree, a master, and we expect them to come to us. Whereas if people who are in the workplace, who are busy, don't have time to leave their workplace and come to you and spend a year or two with you. So you have to go to them. You have to provide customized products, customized learning, and personalized learning. You even have to embed yourself in companies and with employers, etc. So they are doing it in some ways by default. And when you talk to them, they prefer that they don't do it. So it will require that we in higher education bring the employers at the table and say, what are your needs and how can we meet your needs? Whereas traditionally, we haven't done that. So that's an opportunity for us.
Which schools are doing that? Which schools are leading the way and showing how that can be done?
I think you are seeing a change in, you have various schools, including Northeastern, so I'm not trying to to focus too much on us, but we have programs where we worked with GE on having an advanced manufacturing with GE. We even went a step further with IBM, and IBM has 5,000 badges, micro certificates, that are becoming little by little industry standards, and we adopted them. And we said, we are going to accept those. We worked with the tech companies in Seattle and now in Silicon Valley to create new programs to move people into computer science, people who are not in computer science. So to answer your question, there are various experiments happening in the nation. Northeastern has been doing that, Maryland has been doing that, others have been doing that little by little. But what I am calling for is not for these experiments to remain as experiments, but to become core and become routine in what is being done in higher education. In some ways, Frank, if we don't move into lifelong learning and consider it as a core mission, we may end up like the railway industry that said, when they saw the airline revolution happening, this is not our problem because we are in the railway industry, not in the transportation industry. And same thing, for higher education, we have an enormous opportunity. And if we don't move into that, we are not into the education of 18 to 22. Our core mission is educating people for life and making them robot-proof. And that's an enormous opportunity.
When you talk about higher education moving, what does that look like specifically in terms of the college experience? I mean, do we need to rethink what people major in? Is the concept of majors itself obsolete? What should change fundamentally about what we all think of as the quintessential college experience?
For instance, when I say that we need to prepare people to have a robot-proof journey, what does it mean? It means that they have to master what I call humanics. And that answers your point about the college experience. Namely that I'm saying that every student should have an understanding and a mastery of 3 literacies. The tech literacy, understanding computers and how they function. And the data literacy, understanding the sea of information being generated and how to navigate that. And focus on the human literacy. And what does it mean? What is a human literacy? Human literacy is the ability to be innovative, creative, culturally agile, global, ethical, empathetic. Namely, focus on those attributes that so far machines have not matched. And so to answer your question, the curriculum has to integrate those and integrate them in such a way that will allow you on your journey to test your advance. It's not that I'm interested only in physics or in chemistry or in English or history, but are you mastering the 3 literacies and are you integrating them?
I'm biased, but it sounds to me like you're making a case for the good old-fashioned liberal arts.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of making the case for the human literacy, and no, in the sense that traditionally, we pitted the liberal arts on one side and skills on the other, whereas I am saying you need to integrate the 2. So you cannot be only focusing on acquiring and honing the skills, and and there is no point in focusing only on the human aspect. Is the integration of those 2 that will allow you to begin your journey, a robot-proof journey.
So if I'm today's English major or today's history major, I need to be an English major plus.
Absolutely.
What's the plus? What are those courses?
The plus is precisely the plus that will allow you to understand technology, to understand data, to understand the human factor, and to bring them together. And that's the opportunity. So if you are in a setting that is not conducive to doing that, you can have combined majors. It's a journey, and it's a lifelong journey. So by the time you leave college, it doesn't mean that you're stopping this, this journey and this inquiry. So yes, you're an English major, go look at a minor or major in computer science. Go understand what's happening in biotechnology. If you are in engineering, why don't you understand what's happening in economics, in philosophy, in ethics, in et cetera, in design?
I want to read you something you wrote and ask you about it. You have noted that today intelligent machines are picking stocks, doing legal research, and even writing news articles. Luckily, you did not say opinion columns. To continue with what you wrote, simply put, if a job can be automated in the future, it will be. So what are some jobs that can't be automated? And what does that suggest about what we should all be teaching kids and having them study?
Namely, the jobs that will require innovation, the jobs that will require creativity, the jobs that will require reflection, the jobs that will require, thinking about the world in a different way. The jobs that will allow you to see a crisis somewhere, a humanitarian crisis, and to set up an NGO. I haven't seen yet a computer being entrepreneurial in this respect.
Can there really ever be enough of those types of jobs to employ everybody?
We don't know. The candid answer, we don't know. But, we have...
We're going to find out, right?
We have to find out, but the whole idea is that we have to think about what will remain and focus on that. And which means that what will remain is precisely this ability that you have to write an opinion, a piece that a computer cannot write, because you're thinking, you're looking at the angle from a different perspective. You're going beyond the data. You're going beyond. You're looking at contextual interpretations. Computers haven't been good at transposing, and understanding context. That's what will remain. Politicians will remain too.
We are almost out of time, so as a final question, let me ask this. You've talked in general terms about government stepping up, higher education stepping up. If you could make 5 specific things happen tomorrow that would set us on the right road, either from the government, higher education, both, what would that list of 5 be?
For higher education, integrate lifelong learning as a core mission, and have at the table the employers to understand what is needed. For companies, start, and they have been doing that, start thinking about not only about how to re-educate, retrain your people, but provide, build partnerships with higher education to do it. So higher education has to do it, you have to do it too. The policymakers is provide incentives for all the two players to come together and foster innovation, seed innovation. This has been done in the past. I will give you an example of with GE, when we worked with GE at Northeastern and on advanced manufacturing. This was seeded by the federal government. Similarly, when you look at financial aid, you're looking at financial aid only for a certain period. Look at it as a lifelong endeavor. So each one can do his or her part, and each one can help society become robot-proof.
President, thank you very much.
Thank
We're
you,
out of time.
Frank.
We're going to kick it
Thank
back
you.
to the survey findings after.
Frank, thank you.
Nice seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. I think it's ideal to warm up data with a discussion, so thank you both for getting us into the right mindset with this. I'm going to just go over some of the high-level findings from this study. There are hard copies of the full report handy, so I hope you take one of those with you. I'll also show you a very cool data visualization tool that Northeastern developed and point you to the website where you can find that. But first, just a little bit of details on the methodology. I mentioned that this was a mailed, address-based sampling design. And we had roughly 3,300 completed interviews. We were aiming for about that number so that we could do cuts by industry, by age, by region, by a number of other things. So if you say, why did you magically arrive at that number? It was so that we could do some of those types of analysis in the report. And this was data collected fairly recently in September and October of this past year. First thing you might want to know is, how did we operationalize the definition of artificial intelligence for the respondents? And you can see the definition that we used, talking about computers, robots, other technology that can accomplish tasks that humans can do, and even learn and accomplish tasks that humans may not be able to do. And then we gave them some prompting examples of things that may be commonly understood under the banner of artificial intelligence. So let's dive into the key findings. I'm going to highlight 5 major findings that we thought were of great interest. The first one is that Americans are largely optimistic about AI. There are certainly some things that they're concerned about, but let's just start with the optimism first. 8 in 10 say that AI has had a mostly positive or very positive impact on their lives thus far. 3/4 say that it will fundamentally change the way people live and work. So we believe that things are going to change in fundamental ways. And then of those, 77% say that that change will be mostly positive or very positive. So in general, it's fair to say optimism and also some anxiety, as we'll share as well. Here's what's interesting, though. As you break this down, there's some surprising data in here, at least for those of us who might live in a major metropolitan area like Washington, D.C. 4 out of 10 Americans say they would be extremely uncomfortable riding in a self-driving car. So we know the technology is there right now. The fears of self-driving cars, including driving behind a truck that might be a self-driving truck on the highway, are fairly significant still. We also know that not as many people as you might expect are using some of these tools. So only 47% report using a digital mobile assistant like Siri, for example. Interestingly enough, 7 out of 10 have never used a ride-sharing program. How many in here have used Uber or Lyft? Just a quick poll of this audience. It's almost everybody. So, this is where a finding like this and this kind of audience might be a little bit startling, but when we think about the US population, it's a very different ballgame. And even if you look at the youngest US adults in the 18 to 35 population, the majority have not used any of those services. So finding number 2, this is where we shift a little bit to the anxiety around artificial intelligence, because that certainly goes along with some of the optimism. 3/4 say that AI will result in the loss of more jobs than the creation of jobs. So there's firm belief that AI is going to eliminate more jobs than it creates. We also know that they view artificial intelligence as a greater threat than they do losing their job to somebody from another country or to offshoring, which I thought was an interesting finding, 58% versus 42%. And then when you ask about whether they're very worried or somewhat worried about losing their own job to new technology, it's about twice as many who report concerns about losing their job to technology as who report concerns losing their job to somebody from another country or offshoring. Interestingly enough, only 4% of US adults are extremely concerned that they're going to lose their job to somebody from another country. So when you start to peel away the data, it's an interestingly small percentage in the grand scheme of some of the conversation and dialogue that's happening across the country right now. And a clear majority, 63%, feel that this is going to widen the gap between rich and poor. Artificial intelligence will widen the gap. So certainly a lot of pretty heavy concerns amidst the optimism. And when we ask the question, just give you a little bit more breakdown about concerns about whether or not AI is going to lead to more job loss or job creation, you can see overall the vast majority say more job loss. And there are some interesting differences here in that you can see younger US adults are more likely to say that there will be a bigger impact in terms of negative job loss than older Americans. Otherwise, there's not a lot of huge differences. A little bit of differences you can see between white collar and blue collar workers. Blue collar workers slightly more likely to believe that it will lead to more job loss. But overall, pretty high percentages who say more jobs will be lost. Now, key finding number 3 is whether or not people feel prepared to work with AI in the workplace, right? How they might interact with these different tools and robots, and also their feelings that they have the ability to reskill or upskill if they were to lose their job to artificial intelligence. As you can see, about 22% of those with a bachelor's degree or higher said they were felt that their education prepared them well or very well to deal with AI in the workplace. So not a very high percentage reporting this. You might wonder, geez, is this just because we haven't had a specific conversation about this? We haven't embedded very purposeful pieces in our education that do this. But of course, you can go back to the age-old argument of the liberal arts, for example, and say, well, one of the designs of the liberal arts is to prepare people to be lifelong learners. So I think there's some interesting challenges here as we think about people's feelings that they might have been well prepared or not to deal with this. A slim majority agree or strongly agree that they would need additional training if they lost their job to artificial intelligence. And then when we ask them about where they might go for that training, there's some interesting divides. But here was one of the first ones on age group differences that I thought was very interesting. So overall, if you just look at the overall respondent pool, it's a split in terms of the percent who think that soft skills are going to be more important for insulating them against the effects of AI versus hard skills. Now, we didn't use those words in the survey. They were operationalized by things like communication, teamwork, right, under the soft skill heading. So we've summarized those as soft skills here. Hard skills included things like math, computer programming, right, just to give you an example. But Americans are split in which they think is going to be more important to insulate themselves from the negative effects of AI. Soft skills or hard skills. What was interesting is that younger Americans are much more likely to indicate soft skills being more important than older Americans. It's almost 2 to 1. So 62% of U.S. adults in the 18 to 35 category think soft skills are more important. It's only 38% among Americans over the age of 65. So I would encourage all of you to dive into the report. This is actually a quick snapshot of the data visualization tool that Northeastern built. On the back of your program, there's a website at Northeastern where you can go and access this. There's also a demo of it out on the big flat screen right out in the lobby. So feel free to take advantage of that. But this is a tool where folks can dive into the data beyond what's reported in the report. Super tool, and I hope everybody takes advantage of it. So now let's shift to whether or not they feel like they can adjust if they lost their job to AI. And we asked the question about how confident they are about being able to obtain the training or education to find a job with a similar salary. And here you can see overall only about 43% of Americans say they're confident or extremely confident. When we combine the 4s and the 5s on this scale, you can see that the younger U.S. adult population is slightly more confident about this as you go across age. Blue-collar workers slightly less confident than white-collar workers. Interestingly enough, if you just look at the 5s on the scale, right? So here you might say, hey, about half feel confident in their ability to reskill or upskill. But when you get to kind of the extreme end of the scale, it's only 18% of U.S. adults who are extremely confident that they'll figure this out, which in the grand scheme of things to me is a fairly low percentage. That's obviously one that we want to try to improve upon in future years. Finding number 4, they're going to look to employers first and foremost. And we asked them where might they go for additional training. Half, which is by far the highest percentage responding to this, is that they would turn to on-the-job training from employers. The vast majority also feel that employers should help foot the bill or be responsible for paying these things. And when you look at the number of other options they indicated, as you can see, it's just a huge differential here. Only about 2 out of 10 say they would turn to a traditional college or university program. You can see about 16% would turn to an online certificate or degree, another 10% to free online courses, 5% to things like coding boot camps. I think the message here is a lot about what President Owen talked about, is that they are going to turn first and foremost to employers, and employers in turn are also going to look at building relationships with universities to help make this happen. Now, the final finding, we asked Americans about various government policy ideas, and one of those was about universal basic income. And so what's interesting is that it's a split, about 52-48 in terms of support for the concept of universal basic income for people below a certain threshold of income who lose their job to AI. For those who are supporters of it, a decent percentage say that they would actually be willing to pay increased taxes to do that, but the vast majority feel that the companies who are benefiting most from AI are who should pay. And there were some interesting proposals, I think, floated that I saw Bill Gates was talking about, taxing companies for robots, and interesting ideas that have been levied out in the space. And so it'll be interesting to see where this goes, but a real mix in terms of support for a concept like universal basic income. What's interesting, though, is that you'll see there is majority support for it for the 18 to 35 population. So it'll be interesting to see whether this grows over time or not, but that was a little peek into some of the policy ideas that we probed at. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to introducing our panelists to discuss some of this, and also to invite you to ask some questions. And let me make sure I've got my full rundown. Sorry about that. So as I introduce each panelist, please feel free to come up. So first, President Aoun, who's going to moderate the panel. We also have Congresswoman Susan DelBene. We have Daniela Rus from MIT. We have Kristen Sharp from New America Foundation. And we also have Matthew Siegelman from Burning Glass Technologies. So thank you all for being here. We could not have a better panel to discuss this. The bios, as you know, are in the program, and you can tell that this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So thank you all for being a part of this today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, President Owen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you for also the great partnership and the great work you have done. Thank you very much. So good morning, and I'm sure that everybody is here to listen to you. So let me start with the culprit here, Daniela. I'm going to talk to you as a scientist and not as a humanist or a policymaker, because Daniela has multiple hats. How far do you think 10, 15 years from now we can go in terms of AI, robotics, etc.?
So it's really a very good question. It's the question on point. I would say that in general, people really expect a lot from the technology, expect a lot from AI, anthropomorphize the technology, but the technology is really not that far along. And so it's true that AI can do extraordinary things. But it's also important to know that in AI, the current algorithms that are making all the headlines are rooted in decades-old technology. So deep learning, you may have heard of, was invented 40 years ago. And just now, the data and the computational power of our machines has caught up with the promise of deep learning. But there is so much left for us to do before we can get machines that will begin to match our competency. So just to give you an example, deep learning is making a lot of headlines because it's getting increasingly better at recognizing objects, for example. So we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean? What does it mean for a machine to say that this is a bottle of water? Well, the only thing it means is that the pixels in a picture of this bottle of water look like the pixels in other pictures of bottles of water that the machine has seen before and that were flagged as bottles of water by people. The machine has absolutely no idea what to do with this thing. It doesn't know. What do you do with it? Do you eat it? Do you drink it? Do you throw it? How much does it weigh? What is the purpose? So we have a very long way to go to develop things like common sense reasoning that are essential. But I would say that on the other hand, machines today can do things much better than we can, some things. So they can remember much more than we can, they can crunch data much better than we can, they can move with precision much better than we can, they can lift heavier objects. And so to me, it's really important to understand the scope of the technology and figure out, like you said, how to partner people and machines. It's not about people versus machines. It should be about people and machines. It should be about us trying to figure out how to use these new ideas, new technologies as tools that will empower us, that will give us, in some sense, superpowers, but that will augment and amplify us, not replace us.
That's wonderful. Let me build on that. So you see, at the same time, machines can do many things better than we can do, and that's what you said. And the research it's really at the beginning now. The impact is already felt. And not only is it felt, but various studies and various projections are telling us that close to 50% of the jobs we know will disappear in the next 20 years. And those jobs are blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs. As I say, machines are colorblind. Now, based on this, I'm going to, before I turn to the Congresswoman, I want to ask Matt here. Matt, you have been studying, surveying, trying to decipher the jobs that are in demand, the jobs that are dwindling. What does your crystal ball tell you?
So I think one of the things that's most important to realize is, while certainly there'll be a big scope of jobs that will disappear, even more than that, what we see from the millions of job postings that we study every day is that jobs are defined by skills, and the underlying skills that define every kind of job are changing and changing rapidly. In particular, one of the things that we're seeing that's most striking and most transformative in the job market today is the hybridization of skill sets within jobs. Essentially, what we're seeing is that jobs are starting to require skills that are orthogonal to the traditional genome, the skill genome of those jobs. So you would see, for example, a marketing manager. We all know people who are in marketing. It's a classic right brain kind of job. Increasingly, the jobs that are hardest to fill, that are most valuable within marketing, are digital marketing jobs, jobs in marketing that might require somebody to be able to build and query a customer database. That's a very left brain kind of function. And so we're increasingly seeing new combinations of skill sets within the job market. And I think that's directly related and driven by the kind of automation that we're seeing that's transforming the economy at large. Essentially what automation is doing is it's allowing, it's first of all making technology more accessible. To Daniela's point, it's about enhancing people's decisions and partnering people with technology, and it's undertaking tasks that we used to have to parcel out to specialists. Brandon was mentioning a minute ago about Bill Gates and his calls for attacks on robots. I think he might be a little loath to recognize that Microsoft Office is actually a robot.
Yes.
And so the notion that that is taking on functions that we would normally have or in previous generations have given to an administrative assistant, that allows us to perform spans of activity that we didn't need to do before. It requires skills that we didn't need to use before, and it means that it is elevating the demand for foundational skills because in order to be able to bridge across, in order to be able to both code and build a database and do marketing, for example, you need to have a stronger frame of judgment and creative thinking.
Now, Kristen, you have been involved, and your foundation has been involved in studying this issue and working on this issue and getting engaged with this issue. So you worked with also the various communities, you worked with the Bloomberg Foundation, and you are building very interesting initiatives with communities in order for communities to cope with that, to respond to that, to flourish in this environment. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So we started a project in 2016 where we were looking at the ways that automation, artificial intelligence, and data-connected technologies in general were impacting the future of work for people, and thinking about, in general, what the story is for what work looks like 20 years from now. How it functions in communities, how it changes the types of jobs that we seek, and really sort of breaking down whether automation will provide more or fewer jobs, and whether those jobs will be structured in the kind of way that we think about right now, whether people will go to a place from 9 to 5 for a set amount of salary and work in a way that we're thinking about right now. And we ended up with a typology in looking at these things that had a couple different kinds of emerging jobs and a couple different potential worlds. We had worlds in which, or futures in which there were a lot of lifestyle kinds of jobs. So jobs that relate to how humans interact with one another, childcare or elder care, healthcare, things related to food or sort of agriculture and intake. We had worlds in which there were company-based jobs where public-private partnerships worked very specifically to set the curriculum and identify the kinds of jobs that were emerging in that particular company or in different parts of that company, and then tailored the education specifically to those things. We thought about the ways in which people were freelancing and branding and marketing themselves through a skill, having a particular area of expertise. And then the knowledge economy, of training more people to different types of the knowledge economy and tech-based jobs, making every kind of job a digital extension of itself. And those combinations, in all four of those sort of typologies of jobs, the common theme was that in almost every approach or future, people, the individual, has to take much more self-directed approach to identifying and creating the kind of work that they want to do. It's no longer easy, and it's no longer a set pathway to go into a field or go into a job and through seniority just stay there and stay in that that field the whole time and just move up that way. You, as the individual, have to identify the kind of skills that you need, figure out how to get or train yourself for them, brand yourself as the expert, and then explain to other people that you're good at it. And that is a different kind, that mentality of entrepreneurialism and having to create your work yourself is a different mentality than we've had so far. And so that's the thing that takes what Matt's talking about in terms of the skills and thinks
That's
about
wonderful.
how we connect those.
That's great. Congresswoman Del Bene, we're delighted to have you because you have been thinking and working a lot on the future of work. And the future of work today, we haven't mentioned that, is going to involve also a large part based on the gig economy. You have been thinking about the future of work and what you can do as a policymaker to help the communities, to help society. What's your thinking on this matter?
Well, you know, the way the world works has changed from a lot of times when the policy was originally put in place. So we have policies from 1986 or 1976 that didn't anticipate a world that we're in today. And so we're very behind when we look at policy. Kristen talked about that people aren't necessarily going to work for one company for their whole lives or do one particular type of job. But policy hasn't really changed about that. When we talk about benefits, benefits have very much been tied to an employer. And so we need to look at this idea of portable benefits, or how do benefits stay with the person. I introduced legislation in the House, Senator Warner in the Senate, on portable benefits to really start pilot programs and trying ideas out to see what works. I think that's a powerful thing that we can do in government, is try some things out, understand what works in this world that we're in today. And we just did a tax bill. Some of you might have heard about that. Yeah. But a lot of the tax policy is still based on this idea of capital and, you know, incentivizing purchase of things. We don't talk so much about how we incentivize human capital, and that's a huge opportunity. And you referred to that a little bit earlier when we talk about lifelong learning and education. We should really be talking about how we incentivize that and how we help make those investments in people. When we look about the jobs of the future, those skills are going to be very important, and they are going to be skills that are constantly changing. You know, I went to a liberal arts college and was a biology major, but also took programming ages ago. But you know, folks were learning to program in things like Fortran and COBOL and Pascal, and so someone of my area who was a computer programmer might be programming today, but aren't using those languages anymore. They've had to learn new things. We need to figure out how people keep up those skills and understand that we're going to have a constantly changing world. And that idea from a policy perspective, how we look at education, how we look at lifelong learning, job training, apprenticeships, so that people get not only kind of foundational training in a educational institution, but also get hands-on training for what a job is actually like, and learning how to really apply that work is going to be important. So these are all areas where policy's behind, and we haven't even talked about issues of things like civil liberties and privacy or cybersecurity, or all the other issues that also are going to be important areas for everyone to think about, industry, but also policymakers, that we have really only touched the surface on these issues and have much more work to do.
Great. Brendan mentioned that we started early and we have been behaving too well. So let's try to create some divergence on this panel. Daniela, I'll start with you because you have a tendency to create to say something that will be controversial about AI. And you believe that people should not worry at all about AI. Tell us why.
Well, I believe people should not worry about AI because AI is really about making tools, making increasingly more powerful tools that we can use. We can use to do extraordinary things. And we already have those tools. AI is already enabling today amazing capabilities. So AI working with doctors is enabling much better diagnosis of cancer. AI working with human translators are enabling people to connect with each other globally. I could talk with someone in China without speaking a word of Chinese, and this is today. AI will really get us at a point where we can move people and goods much safer and in a much more effective way. And today, 1.24 million people die in road accidents every year. Just think about how many people are going to die during this hour that we spend today. So with these technologies, we can make our lives so much better, so much richer. I believe that AI will take on the routine tasks and allow us to focus on what we find interesting and what we find powerful and fulfilling in our lives. But I also agree with you that this does not come for free. We cannot just sit back and let AI come to us, because we really have to constantly train and uptrain. I tell people that if I were to do today what I did in graduate school, I would be out of a job. So I think that we have to embrace education. We have to embrace the idea that learning is good for us, and we cannot expect that in the future we will study for a while, we will know everything we need, and then we will work. The sequential approach to education and learning will change. And the future will be much more parallel. It will be about constantly working and learning. And now, who should be responsible for that is actually kind of interesting. I think the jury's out whether companies or third parties or the government or universities should take that on. Maybe it's a combination. But I do want to say something that you have not mentioned yet. And so here's the thing. So the future of jobs includes so many IT jobs, and today there's a huge gap between the people who have those skills and the people who don't. So I think that an interesting solution is to consider literacy, as you say, but to consider computational thinking and computational making as part of literacy starting in kindergarten. So if we take our undergraduate curriculum in these subjects and we push them down to schools, which is totally doable, we will graduate, in 10 years' time, we will graduate high schoolers who will be much better prepared for entering the job market. And by the way, a lot of countries around the world are doing that. China is doing that, India is doing that, UK, countries in Europe. We're not doing anything. Less than 10% of our high schools offer advanced computer science courses. Think about that. This is America. Less than 10% of our high schools are offering their students the opportunity to study computing, which is where the jobs are.
As you know, Daniela, there is a foundation, an NGO called Code.org, pushing precisely for that. So there are activities, and we are seeing, if you want, as an educator, I can tell you, coding is becoming like typewriting. You know, the audience is more mature. You know what a typewriter is. Namely, by the time students are coming to college, we are seeing more and more students knowing coding. But let me build on what Daniela is saying. You know, Daniela is an educator, and we educators cannot afford not to be optimistic, because we deal with the future. We work with the future. And from this perspective, you know, the fear that you see that was translated and captured by Brandon today by the survey is real for many people. And as a matter of fact, I was talking to some very highly visible leaders in Silicon Valley, and one of them told me, you know, with this situation with AI, there will be masters and there will be slaves. There will be winners and there will be losers. And the whole point of education is not to have free people. And that's what we're talking about. So people need to re-educate themselves, need to retool, and this needs to happen constantly, otherwise we'll be slaves. And that's the point that we are making. So let me turn to you, Matt. And you usually behave, very well behaved. Try not to be. When you listen to Daniela talking about that, what's your reaction? Do you agree, disagree? Tell us something where you diverge here, if you really diverge.
Well, actually, for the most part, I strongly agree. So first, let me start. Sorry, maybe that's bad behavior for me to not do what you want me to do. But first of all, just want to bring some data to the point of the growth and demand for computational thinking across the economy. So we recently looked at the demand for coding skills, and we've done similar analysis around data analysis skills. In fact, it's a very similar pattern, but just talk about coding since we were talking about that just now. We found that overall, if you sort of take all jobs and array them according to their earnings quartile, what you would find is that 50% of top earning occupations are now ones which value coding skills. Spot on 50%. And to be clear, that's not that 50% of top earning occupations are coding jobs or IT jobs. These are jobs in marketing and life science and finance and an array of others. So to have a crack at a well-earning job in the 21st century, there are sets of skills which need to be part of the way that we prepare ourselves. Now, I think I do want to, we may agree here, we may not, I'm not sure. I do think overall, I think Danielle is right to point to the fact that AI is a tool, it is a set of very powerful tools that enable people to become more productive.
So where don't you agree? So far you have been agreeing.
I guess hey.
Yeah, we don't have much time. Get to the point.
Can I get a word in edgewise?
Yeah, absolutely. Go, Matt. Go for it.
So what I would say, though, is this. That does not happen by itself. It doesn't happen by itself because the reality is that AI is a tool that is replacing a lot of activity, of human activity. And in a lot of jobs, that is the substance of the job. Now, here's the thing, and this is why overall I do share the optimism, even if perhaps in somewhat different ways. If our frame of debate is around job stability, then AI is a deep threat. It is replacing human activity in a whole array of jobs, and in some cases, the majority of certain kinds of jobs. If our frame of discussion is around job or career mobility, AI is a tool that can unlock a huge amount of opportunity.
That's a great segue to Kristen. I know that Daniela is dying to give you a rebuttal. And I know Daniela, if I let her do that, then we are here till 10:30 at night, not in the morning. Mm-hmm. And we will do that. And she has great things to say. But Kristen, let's talk about job mobility, and what do you think of this framing that Matt just provided?
Well, I am a little bit more cautious. I think
cautious than him? He's already very cautious.
Well, more cautious than the optimism of AI has the potential to dramatically improve society. Because I think that we're talking about this in terms of a society level versus a personal level. And on the society level, yes, I think there's real opportunity for AI to make things safer, better, more efficient, and sort of improve the way that we live our lives and the functionality of it. But for individual people in the transition period, while we're getting there, in terms of jobs, like there are 6 million people in this country that work in relatively low-level retail jobs, and several million that work in sort of routine-based jobs in lots of different kinds of fields, and that's millions and millions of people whose jobs are poised to be dramatically changed or automated away in different ways. And therefore, I mean, we're in without very clear pathways for people on how to transition to different skills. We're in for a problem. And I think the most alarming and interesting statistic in the Gallup study was that even in the best case scenario, only 40% of people are confident that they could get another job if their job is automated away. And 18% are very confident of that. That's a problem, that we haven't created the clear story of what people do next, what people do differently, what the journey is,
Absolutely.
and provided the pathways to people in how to advance in those circumstances.
So the Congresswoman was resonating with what you were saying, because clearly we need a journey. And how do you look at this journey?
Well, we have this issue today. The Department of Labor said we had 6 million unfilled jobs. I think that was a statistic from last summer. So we have 6 million jobs that are open across our country, and clearly there is a challenge with making sure we have people with the right skills or located in the right areas. So this issue exists today, and it's not just a future issue, but that's not about not having jobs. It's about making sure that people have access to those jobs and that companies can find the workers with the right skills. So this isn't an issue just of the future, it's an issue of now. The other point I want to make is we talk a lot about STEM education and making sure that we have great access to science, technology, engineering, and math, especially in K through 12. But we don't talk enough about what I would say is STEAM, science, technology, arts, and math. Creativity, innovation, the ability for folks to see the interface, the user interface, how does a person interact with technology? I think that's a huge area that gets overlooked. We sometimes have technologists who just look at the purity of the technology and are interested in the code and whether something works, but aren't necessarily as aware of whether it actually can do a good job. People can actually work with that technology. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, but we have to be careful not to just teach people rote technology skills or computational skills and lose sight of the creativity that's important to really fostering innovation that has really made us a leader around the world.
And you're absolutely right. We should write a book together, the next book together, because I completely agree with you, and that's what I tried to push with the idea of humanics integrating the technical literacies with the human literacies. Absolutely right. But I haven't seen a real divergence now. Daniela.
Yeah, I would like to diverge.
Good.
I
Always
would
can
like
count
to
on
say
you for that.
I believe that there will be great innovation in the future at the intersection of fields. And I would like to call out to Northeastern, because Northeastern has been such a leader in defining blended degrees. I think you guys have more blended degrees between arts and technology than any other school in the US. But I would say that while I agree with you, it's important to embrace the arts and to develop the humanities side. My point is, we're not doing anything about computing in schools. 10% of our high schools offer computer science courses. That is so low when the rest of the world is making computing mandatory. So this is not about
important.
This is not about exactly. This is not about not doing arts, but everyone is learning to write. Everyone should learn how to think computationally, and it's not about learning to think, learning to write a program in Pascal or in Fortran. It's about learning a way of thinking, learning to understand how the computer can help you. How do you organize a solution with a computer? How do you work with data? How do you interpret data? I mean, we're surrounded by data. All decision making is data driven. We have to give people the tools to understand how to make sense of the data. And honestly, the other thing I would say is that the train has already left the station. All the fields are computational fields today, from anthropology to zoology. Now, AI just adds a layer. So we're already on this path, and we are now just introducing more powerful ideas and more powerful algorithms. And to your point, I would like to say that I really believe that people can raise up to the challenge if given an opportunity. And if you will indulge me, I have a very short story about miners. So I have become a huge fan of a startup in Kentucky called BitSource. Have you heard about BitSource? So BitSource is retraining coal miners into data miners. And the head of this company, the CEO, is named Rusty Justice. I love his name. So he actually had the idea that when you're in the mine, you have constrained resources, and that's the kind of thinking you do when you write a program. And so he he, having been a miner himself, wanted to do something for all his friends in Kentucky. So he organized this training company, lined up a bunch of jobs, and then told his friends, hey, I'm open for business. And guess what? Nobody came. Okay, so here's this great program. He believes in it, nobody comes. But in the meantime, people are struggling, and the miners are taking jobs in movie theaters and in restaurants, and they just don't pay enough. Well, eventually one guy comes and gets trained and ends up in a fabulous job. And that serves as inspiration for everyone else. So it's
That's
not
a great point. That's a great segue to Kristen, because Kristen, you have been involved with the communities, with these communities, trying to see what they can do, but also to empower these communities, not somebody who is going to tell them, come, I have something for you, but what can we do together? Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so while our first year in Shift had been looking at sort of the national level discussion about automation and AI, our second year and what we're really moving into now is working within communities to develop pilot programs that sort of are ground up. What can we do on benefits? What can we do on connecting people to new skills and training? What can we do to sort of identifying the baseline, what emerging fields, and matching what kinds of economic development a particular community wants to have with what kinds of fields are on the upswing in that area, and starting to think through the real skills for exactly that kind of thing, like Rusty and BitSource and a few other sort of pilot programs that have specifically identified a task that the community or a company there wants to have done, and then training people specifically to that thing, and so that there is a defined outcome at the end of you know, if you make it through our program, we'll hire you unless you have dramatically screwed it up in some way.
Congresswoman Del Bene, you want to say something about that?
So when we talk about opportunity and solving these problems, we have to talk about the reality of infrastructure and geographic disparities. I represent a district, the home of Microsoft, but you could drive an hour and a half outside of the Seattle area and be in a rural timber town where the economy is really struggling. Students there isn't rural broadband available, and so students don't get to do an hour of code or have the same resources available. They're not getting the same education. So when we talk about the opportunities like you talk about in Kentucky, if a company won't move to or locate a facility in a rural area because the infrastructure isn't there for them to be able to do their job or connect, then those opportunities aren't there either. So when we talk about policy and some of the underlying things that need to happen first to really enable these, connectivity is one big area that we really need to emphasize and has created a lot of the disparity that we've seen.
Matt, you are going to have the final comment before we take questions, so please go ahead.
I just want to build on the Congresswoman's point, because one of the pieces of infrastructure that I think people need most desperately, beyond an infrastructure for acquiring skills, even before that, is an infrastructure for seeing where opportunity lies. One of the biggest encumbrances to people being able to reskill themselves to where there is opportunity to take advantage of the kind of pathways that can be constructed is the fact that we don't have a Waze for your career. The reality is that in any given job, when you sort of think about a job as having an underlying skills genome, those skills, even for a low-wage, low-skill retail worker, there are jobs that have upward mobility, that have greater jobs or career potential, that are less vulnerable to automation, that leverage a lot of those same skills, but you need to know which ones they are. We just last week released a report at Davos for the World Economic Forum called Toward a Reskilling Revolution. And the point of the report was to be able to create a methodology for identifying those opportunities. Without reskilling, about 41% of workers either have no options or have very few options. With reskilling, that number falls down to 4%. But again, a lot of the most direct, most of the things that people might be thinking about may not actually have good mobility beyond them.
Great.
And you need to know what skills to acquire, and then to the Congresswoman's point, to Kristen's point, which skills and how to go get them.
That's great. So very quickly, when we look at ourselves as a society, as a nation, Congresswoman, do you think that we're falling behind other societies? Are we ahead
I think
of
we're
other societies?
ahead in some areas, but we're not being as forward-looking as we could be, and especially in policy. We're barely keeping up with today. We're only funded till next Thursday. We aren't looking ahead and really tackling these issues, and I think if we could be forward-looking, there would be huge opportunities for us to build on the success that we've had.
So let's clone you. We'll be all forward-looking. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions. Let me mention that we have microphones. Please, your question should be shorter than the answer.
Thank you. So I noticed that a lot of the data looked at generational change, but neglected to include race and gender. And I was just wondering if any of the data had any particular relevations connected to that?
Brandon, do you want to take the answer to that? We will put you on the spot, so if you want to come back to the podium.
Yeah, well, I'll just say we've certainly got the ability to do the cuts on that, and there are some subtle differences by race. They're not as pronounced as some of the other ones, but it's probably best to take it offline, and I can get you access to some of those points. So feel free to connect with me or any of the Gallup folks. I'll have them stand up towards the end, and we'll be happy to talk with you.
Important point. Any other question? Yes. We have several. So if you can give the gentleman also the mic. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, Nancy Sajadi, Life Quality by Design. I just want to go to Daniela, your point about doctors augmenting health with being able to have AI help doctors and dealing with cancer. What if AI is causing cancer? As in, humans are a process, right? And what is the process of being human? Attachments to other humans. AI, something it doesn't do. Whatever processes it does,
So
it's
what's
a
the
product.
question?
My question is, what are we going to do in higher education about looking at and identifying the relationship between AI and how it might harm us as humans?
Okay. So Daniela, do you want to take a stab at that?
I would just give you a very short answer. Absolutely, we should look into these questions, and I think that I would say that watching my colleagues develop the field of AI, there is constant concern about the unintended consequences. So people are thinking about these issues, at least in the space of research.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a profound question, and it's not only unintended consequences, but also direct consequences. And people are waking up to that and looking at this. Yes, AI can be very positive, but also can be very negative. You know, just to give you a very simplistic point that is at the same time very profound. When people lose their jobs, you know, it's not only they're not only losing their dignity, but they're losing their health, and there are various studies pointing to that. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was wondering if you had looked at the past and the present. There's a huge amount of retraining going on right now. More than half of the community college people are working and retraining themselves. So I was wondering if you'd looked at that. Also, in regard to the past, we don't have any, we used to have 200,000 telephone operators. Now we have 9,000.
Yes.
So.
Yes, and the answer is yes. Let me take this answer because I've been looking at that. You know, if you look today at the people who are involved in lifelong learning, 68% of the learners are doing that. And so therefore, the percentage of people who are involved in lifelong learning exceeds the number of people who are involved in, you know, the traditional education, you know, for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is. However, the issue that the panel has raised is that it's happening very often by happenstance. It's not enough. You know, because all the projections that you are seeing, all the studies are saying that close to 50% of the jobs will disappear, and people will have to re-educate themselves, will have to retool, and many people don't have the opportunity to do it. So a laissez-faire approach. So the answer to your question, yes, you're right. Is it enough? No. And, you know, and that's very well documented. We have data, we have everything on that. Yes, sir.
Chris Stewart with Gallup, and I look after a lot of our advanced analytic programs here, human-machine collaboration programs. I'm interested in your thoughts related to sense makers and translators. There's been a lot of focus on the actual programmers, computer programmers, on data scientists, but we also need human sense makers and translators to be able to interpret those findings. And are we producing those individuals off of college campuses today?
And who would like to take that? The answer is, that's the whole idea behind bringing together the tech literacy, the data literacy, and the human literacy. Are we producing? I don't like the term producing. Are we educating? And the answer is no, not enough. In fact, even when you survey employers, and that's a point that Matt has been, very cognizant of, and he mentioned that today. The whole idea is not only to have the skills, but also to have the people who can interpret the skills and transcend the data and interpret and navigate that. And the answer is no. And that's the opportunity. And, and if you look at, for instance, the results of what they have done and where the demand is, the demand is in these domains. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes. I was pleased to hear the Congresswoman talk about not just STEM, but STEAM and the arts. I'm with the American Alliance of Museums, representing 35,000 museums across the country, and we're looking to do more work with schools, museums and schools. We have science centers. Could you speak to, someone talked about needing to be more culturally agile and more empathetic. Mr. President, I think you spoke to that. Could you talk about how the arts and maybe museums can help in this effort with young people, even with computational literacy?
Congresswoman, would you like to take the...
Sure. I think there is an interaction between technology and people. And when we talk about what that interface is, it's important for for technology to be designed to work well with people, and otherwise we're not going to get the full benefit from it. But it's also important for folks to understand what information they're getting, how to interpret it. It's important for folks to be able to use technology in appropriate ways and not inappropriate ways. All of that has to do with culture, as you talk about. It has to do with how we design pieces of technology and use them. But I think when we look right now at kind of creating this excitement about learning, because lifelong learning really comes if you're excited about learning. And if you're excited about music is actually very analytical. We have a lot of music programs that got cut in schools, and yet music might be the way that someone gets excited and actually learns a little bit more about their computational side or analytical side. We're losing those opportunities, and if that passion's not there, people may know they have to be lifelong learners, but they may not pursue it in the same way. And I always think, if you love what you do a better job. And so I do think that incorporating the arts and some of those passions in actually will help fulfill all of the things that everyone here has been
Matt, your body language is telling me that you have an answer to.
I do.
So go ahead.
You could tell I was probably one of those kids in grade school at this. To be human is to create. And so when I look at the capacity of AI, and this goes back to some of the comments Danielle was making at the very beginning, it is in order to, one of the things that it does is it allows us to be more productive, ultimately to create more. So the very core bedrock that the arts are built upon of creativity is something that becomes more and more important to 21st century work. Tech-enabled jobs, we look at the skills that employers ask for, are more creative jobs. Tech-enabled jobs are 50% more likely, not less, to ask for creativity skills.
Great. I'd be happy to give you my answer, but in the interest of time, let's move to the next question. Go ahead. Who has the microphone?
Hi, for Mr. Siegelman, you spoke about the methodology that you'll be looking for on reskilling, but at this point, what type of jobs or fields do you feel have the highest potential moving forward?
I think there's an array of them, and it depends on where in the spectrum you are, and I think that's a really important point. Very often we will go around saying, hey, look, there's a huge amount of demand for cybersecurity people. Well, if you're a retail worker, that's not a very helpful point. So certainly there are points all over the place. But most importantly, we can look at what are some of those skills that open up mobility at parts of the spectrum they're most vulnerable. So for example, even something as basic as management skills can be a real golden gateway to the middle class to career mobility. For example, if you were a food service worker and you acquire management skills, again, which are much harder to automate, you unlock about a $10,000 pay premium. That is life-changing if you were a food service worker.
Good, good. So we have many hands raised. I don't think we're going to have time for all the questions, so let's balance that between the two aisles. Yes?
Yeah, I just had a question based on what Ms. Roos was saying about the issue of 10% of schools only 10% having computer programs. I'm curious what you think when, how do you solve this issue when there's in general a basic education problem in this country where like huge swaths of the population are not getting adequate basic education, let alone computer
Daniela,
education?
go ahead.
Well, so I think we should review our curricula and we should modernize it. I think we should really think about the rights of children, what they should know in the 21st century, and we should adjust the curricula. I also think we should value education and our teachers, and we should pay them more.
Great. Who has the mic? We have, so what I'm going to do is ask you to ask your question quickly. You'll ask your question also quickly if it's okay, and then we will try to provide a blended answer.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm a coach for workforce development grantees, 3 separate grantees, one in healthcare, IT, and manufacturing. And what I see is what you guys have been talking about. There isn't that integration of the human side and technology and those soft skills. Is there a deliberate and official collaboration with Department of Labor, Department of Education, and organizations like Northeastern University and/or Gallup?
Yes. And the answer is yes. Okay, let's keep going so that we get to that. Since, we'll get you. You'll have the final. Now we have more time. You gave us more time. Thank you. That's a great comment. Go ahead.
Curious if there's specific policies like lifelong learning accounts or models in the private sector education, like subscription models for higher ed, that you think will actually hasten the transition to lifelong learning for folks.
Yes. And what's your question? I think the Congresswoman will take this one. Yes?
Okay, it's good to talk about opportunities for creativity and etc. But AI is created by humans. And how are you going to educate young people the ethics and the values in terms of how to use AI for the goodness of human being rather than destruction?
Absolutely. So let me focus on you, Congresswoman. I think you can bring it all together.
First of all, I'm a big believer in trying things. I mean, the innovative process is trying things, and I think one of the things that we need to do, and some of the ideas we talked about, is let's incentivize different programs on lifelong learning, see what might work or what conditions certain things work in so that we can develop programs that are really effective. And so that's when I talk about being forward-looking, part of it is making sure that we are kind of enabling that innovation and across the country and understanding what we can do to help make sure we build lifelong learning. And when we talk about, kind of my comments on STEAM and before, part of this is also about the appropriate way to use technology. How do humans interact? But you brought up ethics and values. That goes into it. And so it's not just pure technology, bits and bytes. It's also what are we trying to accomplish? What's the right interaction? There was a story, and I can't remember where I read it, that made me think. Someone was talking about how they had a toddler. They were yelling at their device that they had, whether it was Alexa or Google or Siri or Cortana or something like that. And they noticed that their toddler started yelling at other people like they were yelling at the device, because that seemed like the way you interacted. And no one really thought about that going forward. How do we think through these things and understand the implications that might have in terms of the way we interact together? So we're at the tip of the iceberg, and I think you bring up a very important point.
Kristen, you have thought about that. Your foundation has thought about it. What do you say to this question? Ethics, empathy, compassion, cultural agility, diversity, gender. Computers have not integrated those in our, even in our design. So what do you think of this question?
Yeah, one of the things that comes up over and over again in all kinds of focus groups and discussions about the impacts of technology and AI is what's the impact on community, and how do you maintain connections between people in a world where stuff's at least facilitated to be doing it independently. And so we get questions all the time about how do we create a place where lots of different members of our community can come and brainstorm about things or start new programs or figure out ways to interact with one another. I think that's why places like WeWork and things that are co-located spaces have done well. It's and why sort of the community centers of restaurants and coffee shops and stuff have come back in urban areas and are coming back in suburban areas. People want that kind of connection, and you have to think about it.
So the take-home message is the following, folks. Understand artificial intelligence, but focus on human intelligence. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, huge thanks to our panel, and as our panelists go back to their seats, let me just do two things very quickly. One, would the members of the teams from Northeastern and Gallup who worked on the study just stand, because I'm sure there's some folks who want to connect with you, but I also want to say thank you. So Team Northeastern and Team Gallup, if you guys could just give a wave and also give a round of applause for them. Thank you very much. I'm just going to end on this point. A lot of conversation about lifelong learning, and interestingly enough, Gallup ingested the mission statements of 1,000 colleges and universities about a year ago to look at what were the most commonly used words and phrases and mission statements. The interesting thing is, it's actually lifelong learning. So clearly we have made this an ideal in our mission statements. The problem is we haven't really defined what we mean by that, and we haven't measured whether we're doing that. So therefore I would submit that we haven't done it yet. So let's figure out how we do that as well, because I think it is going to weigh deeply in how successful we are with this. So thank you all for being a part of this, and we'll look forward to hanging around and answering further questions.